So this is Darren Cioffi. Welcome back to
Thanks,
Industrial
man.
Cigar Company.
Thank you.
I say welcome back because you've been here a number of times and for a number of years.
It's literally about to the day 2 years since I first came in that door, maybe even to the day. This could be our 2-year anniversary of knowing each other.
Well,
anyway. So happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary to you as well. For those of this is ICCU, so we're going to speak through a little bit. I don't want any of this really coming from me, but more so understanding who you are, what your company is, what your brand is, and let's just learn. So if we could kind of talk to us about kind of your journey into the cigar world, because I know there's such a unique, kind of path that other people haven't taken. So, what is your story?
Well, when I was in high school, I was dealing in antiques. I was interested in books and clocks and things like that at an early age. And I was quite young. My parents were very supportive, right? I rented part of an antique shop in my town on Long Island, and I started selling at the 26th Street Market in New York City called the Annex on the weekends.
Okay.
When I was in high school, so I would go in on the weekends and sell stuff, and it was doing very well for me. I mean, the numbers were small, but for a high school kid, the numbers were astronomical. And during the week, I would go to Pennsylvania looking to buy stuff during the summer when I had vacation from school. And one day I was driving with my mother, and I was probably a sophomore, and we drove past a shop, and she said, "Why don't you go in and see what they have?" And I said, "No, just keep driving. You never find anything in shops, really. We're there to go to certain auctions and whatnot." And she protested 2 or 3 times, and it was definitely that turning point moment in my life. I don't know why. My mother, who, while she was very supportive, is not a person that cared about this stuff. But for whatever reason, she insisted, and I eventually went in and just disappeared. Because the guy had a big old barn, 2 stories, big shop behind a house, and he had a lot of paper, old paper. It was a big messy shop, so he had magazines, posters, you name it. Stuff was everywhere. But one thing that he had a lot of were cigar labels, old cigar labels. And when I say cigar labels, I mean like you open a cigar box, the inner lid label. If you can imagine that, but ones that were never actually applied to the box, right? So to give you the brief history lesson, I think today they say something like 4% of people smoke cigars, and that includes the person who has one at Christmas time. Turn of the century, it was like 70-80% of men were smoking. And you had cigars prior to the Civil War in bundles, and then after the Civil War, they needed a way to tax cigars. They applied all these taxes, and so things shifted to boxes so they could put tax stamps on the cigars. And around 1883, the taxes from the Civil War started to expire, so there was a drop in the cost of cigars. And there were some other things happening around that time, like the Sumatra tobacco from Indonesia was coming in and providing a great source for wrapper leaf. And
when you're saying coming into the United States,
yeah.
And all of the majority of manufacturing, or there was quite a bit of manufacturing in the States?
So the number, if I told you the number of cigars that were being produced around the turn of the century in the United States, it's staggering. It's more than the global production and consumption of cigars today. It was in the billions. It was just an astonishing number. But the market was extremely segmented. So in every little town you went into, there would be, mom and pop operations and garages or backyards or whatever where they were making cigars for the local market. And it was so segmented that they estimate that by around 1910, there were 1 million different cigar brands in the United States. And this is not some made up number, because the labels exist in some of the great collections, to back that up. So you're talking about an enormous variety. And the other side of it is the American consumer at the time was not as, generally speaking, literate as they are today, right? So you could look up the percentage per year of how many people were literate and illiterate in the United States, and this was a big segment of the population. So cigar smoking extremely popular. Every great corner in every city was either a United Cigar Store or some other cigar store. Every town had a plethora of local producers. And this sometimes illiterate worker would go into the shop, look at the big counter of open cigar boxes, and the one single tool that the manufacturer had to communicate with the buyer was that inner lid label, right? It wasn't like today where you have me selling cigars in Norway and Frisco. It was just who was the local guy. And you know, some stuff had a more regional availability. But so huge demand, only one way to communicate, a boom in cigar smoking in general, and a somewhat illiterate population, and a great market segmentation. This was the perfect storm to create what, to this point in time, was quite literally the finest color printing that the world has ever seen, cigar label art.
And I know when you were in here for that, you kind of spoke through what that process and what that art looks like and how they used what it was. Lithography? Did they use lithographs and stone?
I wish I had some reference material, but the process was called stone lithography. So the first step was that someone would create a painting of what the design was going to be for the cigar label. So, you know, whatever the theme was. And the other thing that made these great is, you know, with so many brands and so many different people as potential consumers, anything you can think of made its way onto a cigar label at some point, right? You had transportation themes, you had ethnic themes, you had military, patriotic themes, which were particularly interesting then because the Spanish-American War was happening for part of this.
So they use that for some sort of propaganda?
You know, just slice of life of what people were hearing about in the news. You know, ships, cannons, flags, things that were going on in Cuba at that time. Animals, and then, you know, less interesting things like famous people, authors, sports people, writers, not so famous people, you know, local guys, vanity labels, you know, where you'd put yourself or your children or, you know, whoever. Really, you name it, it ended up on a cigar label at some point. So, like I say, perfect storm made this just thing that appeared and disappeared, and it's, you know, we've never seen printing like this before. And you can imagine today, right? So cigars were a huge industry. What's huge industry now? Like mobile phones? I mean, can you imagine if Samsung and Apple and whoever else, the only way for them to communicate with you was a picture? Imagine what that picture would look like.
Look like an emoji, I
It would be like Back to the Future with the shark coming out of it, or, you know, it would be just off the wall. And that's what happened with cigar labels. It was the epitome of art and technology to make these prints that are sort of lost to time, and people don't realize how good or how important they were.
So then you saw that, and as a teenager, you walked in and you were just engulfed by this.
Yeah, I went to the shop, and, you know, the guy had all kinds of stuff. It was a real mess, but he had a lot of different product labels, like bottle labels, fruit crate labels, things. But he had cigar labels laying around, and I'm looking at them thinking, man, these are 100 years old. The subject matters are wonderful. The printing is off the charts. There's got to be something here. And I wasn't really dealing in paper then. I was dealing in three-dimensional stuff, but I ended up buying a few boxes of labels from the guy because I just felt like there was something. And I started selling them in New York. And, you know, my pricing structure was really juvenile, and I didn't know much about it, but I just kept buying them and taking all the money I would make in the city and go look for more labels. And then I started going to Europe doing the same thing. You know, I went over early on and met a guy from Belgium who became my partner until he passed away a few years ago, and we started cleaning up a lot of the labels that were available in Europe. European labels were maybe subject matter-wise not as interesting as the American stuff, but from the printing quality perspective, even better. You know, particularly the German printers like Klingenberg, they made stuff that, and the Americans used a bronze powder in their embossing. The Europeans used an actual 24 karat gold powder. So the tightness of the lithography, the colors, the gold, just, you know, this stuff just jumps off the page at you. You see boxes today that are just offset prints in the style or like copies of these kind of, but I encourage you to look at some original cigar label art in person and see the difference. I mean, they look like little paintings because all of these colors were applied to the paper separately using 200-pound Bavarian limestones. And like I was starting to say before, the process was first painting the picture, then someone deciding where all of the different colors exist in that image. So you might have like a solid blue background, then part of that background you might have a darker blue, then you have someone's face, so there's going to be a peach color, and then there's going to be like a darker peach, and then maybe a little bit of red on the cheeks and the lips. There are labels where you can see that they used, you know, 13 different colors in the production, and on a proof label you'll actually see the color bar on the bottom with a solid color from each one of the stones.
So you would have just a blue label, just a yellow label, whatever.
And so what you would do is that then someone would take one of the stones and etch out just one of those colors. So if you had a 13 color label, you're talking about 13 large Bavarian limestones, each etched.
Yeah, easy for you to say.
Yeah, each etched with just one of the colors. Now you can imagine, each one of these has to hit this piece of paper with the registration of a pinpoint 100 years ago. And we haven't even embossed it, gilded it, or any of that yet.
And at this point, the literacy rate was low enough that you couldn't just develop a direction sheet how to perfectly do this.
No, this was extremely skilled labor. This would be like hiring, a top tier IT guy now, right? Lithographers were going to work in white suits and top hats. Like, these guys made real money.
Okay.
And they've always been great artists. So there's always people around that can paint you a great picture. But the process of converting art into a stone litho is an incredibly laborious thing. I mean, people are always saying, I deal in antique paper now since cigar labels for almost 30 years, and people say, well, how do you know this is not fake? And I say, well, I'm selling it to you for $50, and faking it would cost about $1 million. So you tell me how we know it's not fake.
So I can tell, even here, it seems as though you kind of cherish that time you stopped in there and it changed it all. You can obviously hear and feel that, but
everything came from it because, eventually cigars themselves. But
so how do you make that transition from falling in love and doing this and getting into the antique labels to cigars themselves?
I was one day, when I discovered cigar labels, that led me into all sorts of paper. So I was dealing in documents, printing, lithography, autographs, you name it, a lot of photography. And this became my life early on. And at some point but tobacco material was the most exciting to me and the most important, because I love old advertising, and there's no advertising that's as great as cigar label art. And one day a guy came by, I was set up at a little paper show, and a guy came by and he said, hey, I got some labels at the house, come on, take a look. So I went back to his house at some point, and he had some cigar labels, but he was buying a lot of early Negro League material from the Caribbean. And this was like the early guy who found all the great stuff that's in the collections now. And he said, listen, I don't know a lot about labels, but I have access to all this stuff. Why don't you come on down with me sometime, and I'll show you around. Maybe you can find some stuff. So I took that opportunity, and I went with this guy, and that sort of began my time in the Caribbean hunting out cigar labels and other paper. And
which naturally opens itself to cigars themselves.
And honestly, it was a while before I smoked cigars, but at some point I did. I have no idea when, or I don't know what my first cigar was. But
you don't have this profound first experience of.
If I did, I don't remember it.
That's so. Once you do make that kind of connection, you start finding your way into here. At some point, this idea of, well, there's a gap there where you start really enjoying cigars, and as you fast forward, you go, well, let's start making my own.
Yeah, I mean, while I was doing this, you're in people's homes talking with people, and people would just give me cigars, and it was never, I'm not smoking factory stuff, I was smoking whatever someone put together, and sometimes it was nothing, but sometimes it was really great. And so after a while, I started trying to, like I say, nudge the blends. Like, hey, this is awesome, can we do this with it? Or influence the vitolas that people were making. But at the same time, I'm interested in antique advertising, so I was buying and selling cigar boxes that sometimes still had product in them. So when people say vintage cigars, to a lot of people it might mean, an 8-year-old box of Havanas or whatever, but for me, we have a tobacco library now that's from the 1870s through the 1930s, and a lot of examples in that time period. And much of this came to me through the antique world because, I was known in that circle for buying that sort of advertising, and I realized at some point, people are smoking this stuff too. So early on, I became involved with all aspects of tobacco at a high level, but through the art world and through the antique world, not necessarily through the typical channels.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then, understanding you produce in the Dominican, you produce in KBF primarily. It looks like that.
Yeah, around 2003, I did it for friends and family and myself for 20 some odd years, and Then in 2013 is when I got serious, and I was talking with Hendrik a lot, and he convinced me that we've got all sorts of great tobacco that you can use. It's just not mass productionizable stuff. You can't make tens of thousands of cigars all the time and have them be at a certain level, but for what you want to do, we can certainly make small runs of fantastic cigars. And so that's what we started doing together in 2013.
And so did that look anything like what we're smoking today? Or do those blends more or less still exist? Was it Aviator, or was that kind of the beginning of Principle?
Aviator was definitely the beginning of Principle, but the philosophy for the Aviator series hadn't quite formed itself yet, right? Like, I went into it a little bit more with more naivety. Like, I thought that it was definitely going to be more productionizable from what I was doing, but I didn't realize that operating at this really high end, how limited I was going to be. Like, I thought that I would have more, it would be more scalable than it actually is. Mm-hmm. So when we started blending the Aviator series, I got to a point where I said, okay, our philosophy is going to have to be very simple. Like I've mentioned before, all the tobaccos we're using are really serious, right? This is the youngest tobacco in any Aviator is 4 years old. Probably 80 to 90% of it is in that 4 to 6 year old range. A few things quite older. The Foot on the Banal is 14 years old. The San Vicente and the Colchon Vallon is about 8 years old now. But anyway,
and that's a big deal. I mean, coming from our perspective, as we see it as retailers, that's a very big deal when you have an aged tobacco of at least 4 years old. If that's wearing a different label, if that's wearing a different brand on it, you're kicking up.
Your average company. The thing is, I'm making my regular production things are in. The production sizes that would be like beyond limited for a typical company putting out a quote unquote limited release. So, for us, we'll get into the limited stuff later, but I mean, sometimes for us, limited runs are a few hundred sticks. It's a completely different animal. I mean, there's boutique and then there's really boutique in the true sense of the word, and that's what we do.
Well, and you mentioned it as well, right? You mentioned it right towards the beginning, is we're not boutique, two people sitting in a garage rolling cigars. Yeah, that's boutique as well. But this is high quality stuff without having to say, this is premium high quality. It is just
true
phenomenal.
Craft production. I mean, we're not boutique just for being small doesn't make you boutique. We can have a machine and make 10 cigars a day. That's not a boutique cigar. What makes us boutique is the level of attention that goes into this product and the quality of the ingredients, which other people are just not able to use from A to Z like we do.
And for anyone that's smoked a Principle, they understand it. Mm. And I'm extremely biased to it from a personality perspective, but just this hits my palate so well. And once you get into understanding what your palate is and how you're blending and how you're working with Hendrik to create this, and I should say Hendrik Kellner Jr., the owner of KBF Factory in Dominican, although each cigar is different, everything is inviting and in the same wheelhouse.
And the reason that comes about is because when you look at cigars in general, the whole landscape of New World cigars, I find that when a person walks in the shop for the first time and says, hey, I want to try a cigar, I've never had one, they give me something light, I'm afraid, right? So they smoke a Connecticut or something soft. If they really enjoy it and they become a cigar person, something that often happens is their tastes go right from light to, man, I love these, give me something really strong, give me something big. And they listen to a lot of the marketing of the industry and buzzwords and, and they end up going for super spicy, as strong as they can find, because in their mind they love cigars. But if they are a sophisticate and they truly have an Epicurean approach to it, eventually their tastes settle right down in the middle. Because in the middle, it's where we live, but it's also where balance lives. In order to get a lot out of a cigar, you need everything. You can make a cigar that's light or that's strong, but where all of the experience is derived from the flavors. This cigar is giving me a lot of things right now. It's giving me this beautiful, at the center I'm smoking suede, but I also have this a gorgeous citrus-like acidity. I also have some earthy tones. I also have faint spices. I feel like I'm smoking something alive. It's not flat on my tongue, it's not one-dimensional. And the only way for me to deliver this layered experience that feels like a living and breathing product is to live in that middle. Because if I'm loading it up with spices for the sake of being strong, you're not gonna get the layers. And if I'm keeping it too light because we're terrified of flavor, you're also gonna be losing something. But in the middle, you know, if someone comes to me and says, I'm afraid, give me your lightest cigar, I can give them a Maduro nightstick, and they're still going to say, wow, that's really good, because the cigar's in balance. Yes, it's more intense. Yes, it's a stronger cigar, but the flavors are in balance. You know, it's easy to make a spicy cigar. If I want to make a strong cigar that's just loaded with spice, that is not hard to do. So we want to give that smoker that wants something strong an intense cigar, but again, deliver that intensity through flavors. And technically in the middle is where that all lives. But you can't lose scope of the other things that are important to making a cigar, right? Like, one thing that's so enjoyable about this is I can take a light puff and I have a beautiful mouthful of rich smoke. If it's, you know, when you're blending, you're not just blending for flavor, you're blending for mechanics. You're blending for volume. You're blending for combustibility. These are all factors that are important. I mean, I've made cigars that I absolutely love. You know, I'll sit there and smoke and enjoy and be in heaven, but it's not a cigar that can be productionized because maybe I got to take 4 puffs before I get the combustion up to where I get that mouthful of smoke. But privately, I might play around and enjoy that. Or, you know, you have a cigar where your fillers are burning more rapidly than the external tobaccos. Well, that's going to keep going out. It might taste great, but it's not a cigar you can put out there, right? So these factors are just as mechanics are just as important as flavor.
And so let's talk, as we're talking through kind of the blend and your blending process, we don't necessarily need to hop into your process in specific. However, I know there is an approach that you take within the Aviators and really within all your cigars that makes you different. And in full, you know, in the spirit of full disclosure, when you first came and told us this, I thought, I don't know if I dig that approach.
Yeah, you're not alone. But the reality is, this is everyone's approach. They're just lying to you.
You're exactly right. But then when I tasted the cigar, I thought, that's it. It tasted and it experienced trustworthiness.
Yeah.
And so if you could just kind of talk just briefly about that approach and how, you know, it is, like you said, everyone's approach, but you're just not going to bullshit it.
It's everyone's approach with one key difference. The reality is, with, you know, this is a plant, right? There's 7 different plants that went into making this finished product. This is volatile. These plants are subject to changes in the terroir, changes in weather, changes in what, you know, seeds, what farmers are growing. Anything can impact any one of these things. So particularly when you're operating at a level where you have very flavorful, rich, and at the same time delicately balanced cigars, these small changes will have strong impacts on the finished product. So if we have 7 tobaccos here, we don't actually, we have 5 tobaccos here, but if we have 5 tobaccos, let's say one filler has a particularly better growing season for the bale that we're about to use than it did the time before. You know, on paper you might say, fantastic, it's going to be better, but that completely might not be the case. It may be that now that slightly more intense tobacco is going to overpower 2 other fillers and complexity's gone from the cigar, right? So there's no such thing as, this is my recipe, let me make the cigar all the time. What most manufacturers are doing is they're making the necessary adjustments, but the focus is consistency. You know, they want to have a cigar that's exactly the same all the time. And I can tell you the only way to do that is to mute things to at least some degree. You cannot have a cigar that's incredibly vibrant, that's telling a really specific story, and make with ease the exact same cigar every time you go to production. It's just the nature of things. Even the tobacco that's sitting there, if it's the same, is aging, it's changing. So we said early on, you know, in Aviator, each cigar is a completely different blend, right? We blend to the Vitola. They all have certain similarities that make them part of this family. And for us, Aviator is what we call a limited ongoing production. So we're always making the Brindille.
And you basically signify the Aviator series based on this kind of satin metallic silver band or black band.
Yeah, this band with the angel with the propeller is, if you see that, you know it's an Aviator. I mean, on the foot band, it says Aviator series. But for us, they are, they're limited, but they're accessible, right? We purposely don't have, we're mostly a European brand. Most of our cigars go directly to Europe. In the United States, we self-distribute, but we keep it to a very small number of retailer, you know, partner retailers like you guys.
Like Industrial Cigars,
like
basically
Industrial Cigars, right? Like, I mean, you're a bit of a cigar vacuum for me, but we would rather, even we have some very small partners that are just great partners that nurture the brand. I mean, they don't have retail outlets where they're going to be able to sell tons of cigars, but as long as they love the product and they can put it in the hands of some people who really appreciate it, they're great partners for us. So Aviator series, and they have to understand this whole process. You know, each Vitola is supposed to tell a certain story. You know, this Brindille is supposed to be leathery. It's supposed to have the other characteristics I talked about. And so what we're going to say is, when we go to production on it, what's the very best way we can tell this story right now with the tobacco that's on hand? And the other thing that enables us to do is, you know, we're constantly buying and sourcing great groups of stuff. If you know, if we have an opportunity to buy a really small group of tobacco that's exceptional, I want to be able to fit that in somewhere. And the only way for me to do that is to, you know, find a place in the Aviator where using it as a component fits within the spirit of that cigar. And okay, maybe there's a small change, but hopefully if you liked it the last one, we can make it even better this time.
And industry-wide, what that allows you to do as well is, just because you have new tobacco, you don't have to manufacture a new cigar.
Yeah, I mean,
a new cigar.
Who wants to do that? And they're not always going to be that good if you're just putting things out for the sake of using them. So, and the other reason why we're not afraid to have this approach is because let's just face reality, okay? One, I always say you're blending cigars for 95% of your consumers. I'm sorry, for 5% of your consumers. 95% of the people, they want something smooth, they can sense certain things, but they're not at the level where, as long as the product is telling the story it's supposed to tell, they can't necessarily pick apart the specifics at the level to have a truly elaborate conversation about it. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. You know, it needs to be smooth, it needs to be balanced, it needs to be properly fermented, construction needs to be on point, but the exact same flavors are not going to be perceptible to a lot of people smoking. Secondly, the way you perceive cigars, I have a great palate, right? Even me, the fact that I'm drinking this coffee instead of the Holiday Inn Express coffee I was drinking on the way here, it's tasting differently now. Time of day, if I have a cold, the mood I'm in, you know, all these things impact the flavors that you're getting. So why am I going to obsess on quote unquote consistency at the cost of vibrance to have a cigar that's going to be perceived differently most times when I smoke it anyway? I'd never understood the point of that.
So from you, it's more experience first versus flavor first? Is that kind of what I'm hearing on that front of things? Or just something that will suit your situation versus...
Yeah, the flavors are an important part of the experience, but those flavors are... Yeah, I guess yes is the short answer to that question, but that's not to say that we're making the cigars are like wildly different all the time. It's, you know, it's supposed to be tell a certain story. I mean, you are not supposed to like one production of Cochon Vallon and not like the next production. If you like it once, you're supposed to like it. We're just always striving, and we hope that it's a little bit better with our tweaks each time.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that I experience. And the Cochon Vallon in particular is the only cigar since we have started that made me change my schedule to come back to the shop to come smoke.
Wow.
And we see that often. We see people who come back here just for the Cochon Vallon. And if we don't have that, the Patrier and the Envoy is a fantastic deal because it's all in that same wheelhouse. So as we kind of identify each one of your Aviator series, really we have as we kind of work our way up, Envoy, Cochon Vallon, the Patrier, the Vanquier, and the Grand Pyramid within your core line, right?
Well, the core Aviators are Envoy, Cochon Vallon, Vanquier, Grand Pyramid. Those four. They all have, at this point, the same wrapper and binder, and the filler tobaccos are all different. They have similarities and differences. The Vanquier was always meant to be the flagship of the Aviator series, but the reality is it's not been. The Cochon Vallon has outsold it in just about every market. But the current, this is the Cochon Vallon, just for visual purposes. It's this tapered cigar. The Vanquier is a 56 by 6.5. And the current blend of the Vanquier for me is the best that it's been in years. It's really hitting the spot. You know, it's got that rich sweetness like a dried fruit. It's got the leather. It's got some earthiness to it. It has that still the hint of acidity to balance things out. Just, it's been a gorgeous smoke, but we'll see what it can do in the coming year against the Cochon Vallon.
You do have a couple kind of different approaches within your different series. One, the Gold Band series. I don't know if you could kind of touch on what that is.
So we have this crazy Aviator blending process, right? We're trying all these things all the time. We're trying new tobacco, we're tweaking the blends. surprising things happen. We sometimes end up with blends that are, you know, really interesting, really engaging, but they just don't quite fit in the spirit of the Aviator series, but they're great. Sometimes also we end up with small groups of tobacco where, okay, we're willing to make changes, but if we can only make 1,000 cigars or 500 cigars, and there's no point in productionizing it. So we came up with this gold band project, and what it is we always make a 6x50, but they change, unlike Aviators, which change with a purpose in a certain wheelhouse, these will change dynamically. We can make something spectacular in this format. We'll put it out even if it's only a few hundred cigars. So if you light up a gold band, expect something that's awesome, but that can be different every time you smoke it. And then we priced it so that the consumer gets a bit of a value too. So it's a 6x50, and it's at about the same retail price as an Envoy, which is the Robusto and the Aviator. So Gold Band gives you a unique, vibrant experience from the same factory as Aviator series, but it's also made for guys like me that get bored. I get bored even of smoking my own stuff, and you know, due to the dynamic nature of it, it's a way to keep you excited and interested.
And then on the other side of things, you have the Accomplice series.
Accomplice, we wanted to have a cigar that was a bit more of an everyday smoke, and the first cigar that we came up with is the Accomplice Classic. The Classic is the one with the white band. Accomplice, you can tell, they all have these little satin bands on them. And
in the box you have a pocket
yeah, we
square.
put pocket squares that match in the box, so if you buy a box, you get a pocket square. The Robusto's the house cigar of the Curia Club in Helsinki, that's why it has the second band. But this cigar has been just a killer. I mean, it's primarily in the European market where it's up against Cubans, and we have one shop in Eastern Europe where not only is it the #1 selling cigar, I think they said that Ahoyo de Monterrey Epicure was, it sells like 1/3 of what this cigar sells. You know, it's just been a killer everywhere it goes. Cigar Journal had given it a 92. Cigar Journal 92 is like a...
What do you think of that cigar?
For me, it's...
I'm trying to pin you here.
I like it.
Yeah.
It's layered, but I mean, I rarely need an everyday cigar. What I smoke more often is the Accomplice Connecticut, which is the exact same filler and binder, only it uses a 5-year-old Connecticut wrapper. And that's why sometimes people say, well, that's not a Connecticut. You know, with a lot of age, the wrapper gets a little bit darker. And this Connecticut, you know, just like I make Maduros for people who want to know what a real Maduro can be, this is a Connecticut for people who don't like Connecticut's. Yes, it's a softer cigar, but it's layered, it's complex, it gives you so much. I put this Connecticut up against a lot of far more expensive cigars any day of the week. It's a gorgeous, like, late morning, first cigar of the day, but still gives you layers and so much to enjoy.
Yeah, and that's what we see within there. And then there are a couple other Accomplices
And
that you run.
I should also note, like, you know, our goal was to make this a more approachable price point, have a more approachable price point. And so one thing we did was, the binder is the same Ecuadorian Corojo wrapper we use on the core Aviators. So after we make Cochon Volant, for example, any leaf that's not quite perfect enough for wrapper, that has some blemishes, we then use as the binder on the white band and the blue band. So you get some of those same, you know, super expensive flavors, but at a price point that's more everyday.
And then within there, you also have one cigar that really sold me on the line in particular, which is that purple.
The purple band comes from a different factory. It comes from William Ventura, and yeah, it's just a beautiful. It's a Corojo as well, but different wrapper, and that's the only blend that they do for me, and it's just, we've perfected it, and it's gorgeous.
It really is fantastic.
It's a weird one too. I mean, it has this hickory smoke and the sweetness, and I find that the people that like the purple band love the purple band. Like, it's not for everyone, but those that like it are just crazy fanatics about it.
So, and then kind of to finalize that and kind of round it out, you have the green label Maduro.
Yeah, so the green label, incidentally, the band is changing. It's going to be a little bit darker in future productions. The first Vitola we launched was the Nightstick, the 7x58. We wanted a cigar that was a big cigar for people who don't like big cigars, and a Maduro for people who either don't necessarily smoke Maduros or who are a Maduro purist, right? Yes, it's big and dark, but if you close your eyes, that's not, you know, the type of consumer that's typically attracted to a cigar like this either wants something that's looks tough but it's actually very light, or they want something that's super spicy and crazy, and we did neither of those things. This is a natural Maduro. The wrapper is not pressed or dyed or oiled or anything like that. And it's, the experience is rich and balanced. So it's not a bunch of spice. It's not harsh for the sake of being Maduro. It's not light for the sake of tricking the consumer, or for the consumer to trick himself, in a sense. It's medium-bodied, medium plus flavor-wise, like similar to Aviators, but it gives you baking spices, it gives you sweetness that builds. It's also a cigar that fights you back. Like, I'm a guy that puffs a lot, I smoke quickly, so I have a tendency to heat up cigars. This Green Band in particular, if I see a guy is abusing cigars, this is a perfect smoke for him. Like, if I'm not paying attention, I'm that guy. And if I puff too much, it fights me back, it burns well, it doesn't heat up, and it's rich right to the end.
It's a fantastic, it's a great product line that does extremely well here. Your story is awesome. Your personality is second to none, and well, depending on, definitely top two at the table. But with that, I'm very excited to be a part of your growth, and for you to be a part of our growth as we continue to grow. You do our house stick for us.
You guys have been instrumental in the United States, and I couldn't ask for better partners at this stage of our development.
Well, really. and I look forward to continuing to grow that, and friendship, partnership, relationship all the way through. So thank you for being here, and for doing what you do.